Burmese pythons in Florida are a huge threat to the local environment and economy, and of course, people are trying to deal with it. Still, let's be honest, the current efforts are just a drop in the ocean. The population of these snakes in Florida, especially in the Everglades, has already grown into the tens of thousands, maybe even more. Nobody really knows how many of them are hiding out in the thickets around the swamps. Meanwhile, the annual Python Challenge takes out 100 or 2 snakes. Since 2017, state agencies have removed more than 10,000 of them from the wild. Sounds like a lot, but it's still not enough. So what do you do in a case like this? For example, drop millions or even more mice across the Everglades and most of Florida? History and the island of Guam know this is a working method against invasive snakes, and it really could change the situation in the state. But for better or worse, that's another question, and we're going to answer it today. Once Guam was like a paradise with a live orchestra in the trees. The birds here didn't just sing, they set the mood. Picture this. You're walking down a path and all around you dozens of bird voices, chirps, whistles, trills. They weren't afraid of people, didn't hide, because they faced no real threat. But the idyll came to an end when, in the mid-20th century, an uninvited passenger arrived on the island along with military equipment, the brown tree snake. At first glance, nothing remarkable, not very long, mildly venomous, not aggressive, but that's only for humans. For the local wildlife, the snake became a perfect killing machine. At first, no one really understood what was going on. There were only a few snakes and they acted discreetly, but unlike the local creatures, they had enormous appetites and a knack for trickery. Their favorite delicacy was birds and their nests. For Guam's birds, this was a shock. For thousands of years, they lived with no land predators and they simply never learned how to protect themselves. They laid their eggs without worry on low branches or even right along the trails. And for the snakes, well, it was basically an all-you-can-eat buffet with no competition. That's how the quiet conquest began. Each snake could devour dozens of birds per year. Multiply that by thousands of snakes, and you'll understand why by the 1980s, Guam faced a real invasion. Scientists recorded some mind-blowing numbers, up to 5,000 snakes per 0.4 miles of jungle. No other place on Earth had ever seen anything like it. As a result, the snake became something like the island's shadow. Wherever you were, somewhere nearby, a brown tree snake was already gliding along the branches. The impact on birds was devastating. 12 species stopped breeding locally, and 8 species saw their population shrink by 90% across the island. Cultural traditions, songs, legends, all of it was cut short along with the disappearance of the birds. Besides that, the brown tree snake, with its constant urge to climb, could mistake a tree for, say, a power line. The result? Regular blackouts, about 200 outages a year. Imagine what it's like to live on an island where not only have the birds disappeared, but the electricity can go out at any moment because a snake decided to sit on a wire. And yes, it's claimed this has also caused total economic losses of up to $4.5 million. Doesn't this situation seem familiar? Of course it does. It's like with the Burmese pythons that have overrun Florida, wiping out several species and creating other problems for the state's residents. The situation isn't exactly the same, but it's definitely very similar. And what's very important for Florida is that it might take a page from Guam's playbook in tackling the snake situation. Here's a brown tree snake. Here's a paracetamol that helps us with headaches, and at the same time, as scientists have found out, is lethal to the invasive species on Guam. 3 ounces of the substance is enough for an average individual. Obviously, a snake won't just eat pills, so people realized there are mice that snakes eat, so you need to put paracetamol into them. How to deliver it? A cardboard attachment, a helicopter, and a mouse with a surprise inside falls from the sky onto the trees where the invasive snakes of Guam are crawling. And you know what? It worked. The method started being widely used in the 2010s, with about 2,000 mice dropped during the first campaigns. Then the scientists surveyed the areas and concluded that in certain regions, snake numbers had fallen by 80%. Larger operations involved dropping up to 30,000 baits at once. This made it possible to control the population across big stretches of forest. Not too complicated, not too expensive, and most importantly, it works as a way to cut down the numbers of invasive snakes. Time to launch such a mouse-dropping campaign in Florida because the Burmese python situation is getting way out of hand. This method is perfect for Florida because, first of all, paracetamol is just as deadly to Burmese pythons, and secondly, the Florida invasive snake is a moving animal-eating factory with an insatiable appetite. It doesn't pick prey based on tasty or not. It cares about one thing: whether the catch can fit inside. These snakes eat everything that moves and doesn't manage to crawl or fly away. In their menu in the Everglades, there were raccoons, opossums, and wild boars. Scientists have even found deer in python stomachs, whole, with hooves and antlers. With a body that can stretch like a rubber stocking, appetite knows no bounds. This diet is really important for a species whose adults can reach lengths of 12 to 16 feet and weigh around 165 pounds, and in some cases, Burmese pythons have exceeded these numbers. But would a tiny mouse be enough for them? No, which is why adult pythons go for bigger prey. But there are young pythons which are roughly the same size as adult brown tree snakes. Baby pythons can grow up to 6.5 feet, and mice are prey that fits their size, which is why they actively feed on such small rodents. At the same time, it's also really important that young individuals, unlike adults, are generally more likely to climb trees, just like the brown tree snake. That's exactly where gifts for Florida's most dangerous invasive species might fall. Sounds perfect. Drop mice laced with paracetamol, the young snakes pick them up, eat them, and then die. Population control that could have a pretty serious effect, since without the young, there won't be adults in the future. Yes, they'll have to drop an insane amount of mice, probably millions rather than thousands, because Guam is still nowhere near the Everglades and definitely not Florida in terms of size. Still, it should work. Not quickly, but it's the long-awaited rescue from invasive Burmese pythons in a state that's been suffering. The positive effects, however, can't even begin to outweigh the disaster that Florida will face if the mouse-dropping strategy is actually carried out. First of all, let's say that paracetamol isn't just toxic to brown tree snakes and pythons. Because of the way their bodies work, only humans and a very few other species can tolerate it. For the vast majority of animals, though, paracetamol is poison. Now let's take a look at the Everglades. It's home not just to invasive Burmese pythons, but also around 60 species of reptiles. Over 350 bird species, 40 mammal species, and 50 species of fish. Imagine, because of the invasive pythons, raccoon and opossum populations have dropped by about 90%. And because of this, millions of dollars are spent trying to reduce the population of these Burmese guests. And here we have mice literally falling from the sky, and they're part of the diet of raccoons and opossums. You don't even need to hunt them, so any small predator will happily run around collecting this nutritious gift dropped from above, which doesn't put up a fight. The result, populations that are already struggling can take an even bigger hit, or even disappear from certain areas. Any creature less affected by pythons, which feeds on small rodents or carrion, might also eat these paracetamol-laced mice. This includes rabbits, squirrels, and even small predators like weasels. As we've already said, paracetamol acts like poison for animals. Their liver and internal organs get damaged, fertility drops, and survival rates fall. So that light snack can turn deadly. As for birds, the situation, well, it's not so bad, at least for the main consumers of dead animals, scavengers. Studies have been done where a small dose of paracetamol was given to birds for 7 days. No toxicity was found. Another study showed that only at doses 200 times higher do signs of toxicity appear, including changes in liver and kidney tissues. That's a huge amount of mice with paracetamol, not just one or two. But with other birds, the situation is not so bright, because paracetamol has a much bigger impact on them. For example, local owls, hawks, and eagles are birds that don't specialize in carrion, but they definitely won't pass up dead mice, especially if there's little other prey. An adult bird has a chance of survival. For it, a stuffed mouse won't be too toxic, but there's another problem for bird populations. The thing is, these birds often bring prey to their chicks, and these little creatures are far less resilient to everything in this world, especially to paracetamol, which is toxic to so many animals. If they do decide to carry out a campaign of dropping mice laced with paracetamol, Florida cats will be in for a rough time too. Research indicates that toxic effects can appear in these animals even at tiny doses. Raising the dose might end up being fatal. A prime example is the Florida panther. Predators of this species are, of course, used to hunting bigger prey, but they often go after smaller animals too, or even scavenge. And a mouse carcass on a branch or in the grass can look like an easy meal. No chasing, no effort, just grab it and eat. A paradise for anyone who's used to hunting their own breakfast, lunch, and dinner. At the same time, we're dealing with a species that's considered endangered. Today, there are only about 120 to 230 individuals left in the wild, and their numbers keep fluctuating depending on disease and habitat loss. Now imagine millions of mice falling from the sky, deadly to lynxes, which the entire population could feed on. Nothing good is going to come of it. At this point, cat owners should really pay attention because, just like Florida panthers, house cats are also felines, just smaller. House cats may hunt small rodents thanks to their natural instincts. That's the prey best suited for them. Any owner whose pet has dragged home a mouse, a rat, or another rodent can vouch for that, and a cat doesn't distinguish between a bait for a python and safe prey. For them, a mouse is always legitimate prey. Large-scale bait drops turn a well-meaning campaign into a potential trap, especially in areas where homes and backyards border the Everglades swamps. Here's an example from India. A 2-year-old cat showed signs of poisoning after eating 0.02 ounces of paracetamol that her owner had left out. She had vomiting, facial swelling, anemia, hyperthermia, and yellowing of the mucous membranes. The pet was treated, however, it's not always possible to get them to the clinic in time. Not every cat will make it back home. And by the way, domestic dogs also don't have a natural ability to break down paracetamol without consequences, which is confirmed by a rather odd case from India. 6 dogs, aged between 2 months and 3.5 years, showed signs of poisoning after their owners gave them paracetamol to ease pain. The symptoms included fever, weakness, swelling, and anemia. Again, the dogs were saved, but that isn't always the case. So let's put our pets aside and look at another scenario. Suppose the authorities really do go ahead and drop mice laced with paracetamol to cut down the Burmese python population. But not all of those snakes will be eating gift from above. In fact, the mice laced with paracetamol won't end up in only the mouths of Burmese pythons, because in the Everglades, and in Florida overall, there are plenty of snakes for which mice are also a regular part of the diet. Moreover, many of the snakes, even without additional threats to the population, are species that are already facing problems. This is an indigo snake, and it's very important for Florida because it can eat small, not yet mature pythons, cutting down the population of the state's most harmful invasive animal. On top of that, the snake can also feed on other not-so-big creatures like mice laced with paracetamol. Meanwhile, the indigo snake population's really suffering from human activity, which is why there are so many programs focused on restoring it. And now you've got mice falling from the sky, cutting down the numbers of a species that's both struggling and incredibly useful for Florida. It's possible that these snakes have some protection thanks to immunity against other snakes' venom, but since no one has tested it, the risk is still there. Rattlesnakes are also at risk, even though their populations are under much less pressure, but they too will happily feed on poisoned mice, which will make their numbers go down. And if the scale of poison drops for pythons gets really big, then the rattlesnakes will probably become vulnerable. You'd think fish are the kind of creatures that wouldn't be in danger if mice with paracetamol began falling from the sky, because who would dump a toxic gift straight into reservoirs or rivers? But in fact, the poison can make its way there as well. Burmese pythons are animals that stick mostly to wet habitats, meaning lakes, marshes, rivers, and the like. And after all, it's no accident that these invasive snakes made their home in the Everglades. It's nothing short of a water paradise. People will, in any case, have to drop the mice somewhere near the water, and here there's a very high chance that the paracetamol will end up right in the water because airdrops aren't exactly known for their accuracy. And down there, underwater, the predatory fish will immediately start feeding on what's been dropped from the sky. As a result, even the beings that seemed safest from the paracetamol campaign are not safe at all. That said, even animals that don't eat mice at all, or do so in small, harmless amounts, won't be safe. The thing is, in the Everglades food chain, every link is closely tied, and dumping mice laced with paracetamol sets off a domino effect. If a small predator, say a rat or a swamp squirrel, eats a poisoned mouse, the toxin enters its body. Even if the animal survives, some of the paracetamol will remain in its tissues. When a bigger predator, like an owl or a heron, eats that animal, it'll suffer secondary poisoning. And there are countless such chains. Now let's talk about farmers, gardeners, and basically anyone who grows plants. Paracetamol even affects plants. For example, in wheat, it slows down the growth of roots and shoots. Lettuce and spinach suffer too. Almost every study on paracetamol and any plant concludes that flora experiences stress. Of course, it's worth noting that the concentration would have to be much higher than it was in those mice dropped in Guam, but no one really knows how much or what could theoretically be dropped in Florida, so negative effects on the local flora can't be ruled out either. Overall, it's obvious that such a campaign would be a complete failure, so Florida has to settle for hunting pythons, which is done both by individuals and by entire organizations. It's not very effective, but at least it helps to somewhat reduce the numbers of these invasive predators until scientists come up with something better. Still, even if dropping paracetamol-laced mice didn't have scientifically proven negative effects, it would still face public skepticism. That's exactly what's happening in Australia. Many studies and tests were carried out, after which Australia realized that some local plants contain a poison, sodium fluoroacetate. The native fauna, having evolved alongside it, developed some resistance to the substance, while foreign species like foxes, cats, and dogs can be poisoned to death. The country came up with an idea. This poison could be used to get rid of species that had arrived on the continent and were destroying local nature and the economy. Now the so-called Poison 1080 is used all over the country. That's the name given to the substance harmful to invasive animals, and it's being used quite successfully. So, for example, in Western Australia, killing invasive species with Poison 1080 has boosted the population of vulnerable animals like the woylie and the quokka, which were at risk of disappearing. On Kangaroo Island, which is considered one of the key wildlife refuges, regular programs to control feral cats and foxes have helped prevent the mass killing of local species like koalas and wallabies. However, as is often the case, it wasn't that simple. Although Poison 1080 does help cut down the numbers of foxes that kill millions of birds, reptiles, and small mammals every year, this method sparks heated debates. The first thing that irritates opponents of the poison the most is the process itself. Yes, the poison works. Yes, foxes and cats die. But it all goes like this. The animal eats the bait, and then a painful death begins, lasting several hours. The Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals has entire reports calling Poison 1080 one of the cruelest control methods, and by this point, it's hard to just brush it off, even if we're talking about invaders. But the most heated argument isn't really about being humane, it's about who Poison 1080 actually kills. The bait doesn't know whether it's facing a fox or an eagle. In South Australia, there were instances where poisoned bodies of dogs and foxes became a deadly feast for local birds. And eventually, the birds ended up suffering and dying alongside the invaders. Back in the 80s, seroscientists published data indicating that certain sparrows and parrots are pretty sensitive to poison too. And if they accidentally peck at bait, they don't have much of a chance of surviving. In Western Australia, there were cases of local monitor lizards dying after eating poisoned carcasses. There's also another point of debate: resistance. In the early 2000s, researchers recorded that some rabbit populations were showing signs of tolerance to Poison 1080. So the poison, originally meant as a universal weapon, is slowly losing its punch. Critics argue we're heading down an endless arms race, where tomorrow we'll have to increase the doses, and the day after we'll be looking for new poisons. The irony is that the plants containing fluoroacetate, the ones that started it all, have existed for millions of years, and animals really have adapted to them. So why can't invasive species follow the same path? Nobody knows. Meanwhile, supporters of Poison 1080 counter, yes, eagles die, but far fewer than the animals saved by the program. They cite examples of quokka and wallaby populations bouncing back, especially in remote parts of Western Australia. But opponents point out the price of this victory is thousands of agonizing deaths and accidental casualties among rare birds. So we get the classic Australian paradox. The poison seems to help save unique wildlife, but many call the method cruel and outdated. As a result, debates over Poison 1080 in the country have been going on for decades, and every news story about a dead eagle or a poisoned monitor lizard stirs up another wave of discussion about whether it's okay to fight some killings with others. And this isn't the only case where people disagree with an effective solution. In the US not long ago, a controversial method of dealing with dangerous creatures from the company Oxitec sparked a lot of debate. The story of this company sounds like the plot of a sci-fi movie. British biotech experts thought the way to fight mosquitoes wasn't with nets or chemicals, but through genes. They started releasing modified males into the wild whose offspring simply don't survive. The secret's simple. A special self-destruct gene is built into the insect's genome, which activates in the larva. The males don't bite people, but they actively mate with wild females, and as a result, the mosquito population drops sharply. Oxitec first tested the technology in the Cayman Islands back in 2009. That's where the first combat squad of GMO Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, carriers of dengue fever and the Zika virus, was released. The results were so impressive that the population of these mosquitoes dropped by 80%. For a region that used to have outbreaks regularly, it looked like a miracle. Brazil followed the same strategy. In 2011, in the city of Juazeiro, a company, together with local authorities, started releasing millions of genetically modified males. A year later, studies showed a 95% drop in the wild population. What's more, in areas where the project had been running the longest, the dengue rate really went down. For a country where tens of thousands of people suffered from the disease every year, this was a strong argument to keep the program going. The U.S. joined in later. In the 2020s, Oxitec received the green light to release genetically modified mosquitoes in Florida. The project triggered a storm of protests. Locals were yelling about Franken mosquitoes and even threatening to set the labs on fire. But once the pilot releases went ahead, scientists saw that the technology worked the same way it had in Latin America. The number of disease-carrying mosquitoes fell without impacting other mosquito types or pollinator insects. Oxitec had other projects too. For example, attempts to use the technology against agricultural pests. In Brazil, they released modified moths to reduce damage to cotton fields. In the US, they talked about using the method against gnats and pest butterflies. So far, there haven't been major successes in agriculture, but the idea sounds appealing. Instead of chemicals that hit the whole ecosystem, you use precise genetic weapons against a specific species. And yet, the more celebrated these successes were, the hotter the debates became. The main gripe of the critics was unpredictability. In 2019, researchers at Yale University reported that some genetically modified mosquitoes in Brazil hadn't just vanished, they left a genetic footprint in the wild population. Some hybrids survived and carried the foreign genes further. Oxitec called the study flawed and stressed that no risks to health or the environment had been detected. Still, the story quickly made headlines, putting the company in the middle of a scandal. Another point of tension is ecology. Sure, nobody likes mosquitoes, but they're part of the ecosystem too. Frogs, birds, bats, they all eat these annoying bloodsuckers. What happens if we suddenly slash their numbers? Oxitec claims nature will just adjust, since there are thousands of mosquito species and losing one won't be a disaster. Yet skeptics remind us we've gone wrong too often when we've tried to adjust nature's balance. The social factor turned out to be just as important. People aren't just scared of the word genetically modified, they're also worried about decisions being made without their consent. In Florida, opponents of the projects held signs saying, "We don't want to be guinea pigs," and called for the releases to be stopped. In Latin America, some communities were also skeptical, not because they believe in conspiracy theories, but because they don't fully understand. What if the consequences show up not in a year, but in 20? At the end of the day, the Oxitec story is a true mixed feelings case. On one hand, actual figures show mosquito numbers can fall by tens of percent without insecticides, saving thousands from illnesses. On the other hand, there are lingering doubts about long-term consequences, potential hybridization, and the ethics of letting GMO animals loose in the wild. And while some countries give Oxitec the green light, others are drowning it in protests and court battles. In the end, even if dropping mice laced with paracetamol in Florida didn't have so many downsides, it's unlikely the project would have been welcomed with open arms. So why did it work in Guam? Well, that's a topic for another video.